So, without further ado, I am thrilled to present Once There Was a Town, the Port Chicago story.
Port Chicago, California, July 17th, 1944, 10:21 in the evening. Two ammunition ships being loaded at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine suddenly explode in two blinding flashes. The explosion leaves the town in splinters, breaks windows 50 miles away, registers 3.4 on the Richter scale at UC Berkeley, kills 320 people, over 200 of them black sailors assigned to loading the explosives. The town itself, adjacent to the Navy loading zone, suffers heavy property damage and hundreds of civilian injuries. It was the largest domestic wartime disaster in American history. The Port Chicago explosion, as it has since been known, set off a chain of events that included the most recent mutiny trial in U.S. history, now known as the trial of the Port Chicago 50. Black sailors who resisted returning to the loading of explosives under similar conditions. The emergence of an NAACP attorney named Thurgood Marshall. The military desegregation order signed in 1948 by President Truman, and a long and divisive battle for recognition and exoneration of the dead and convicted sailors. The explosion and mutiny trial have inspired several books, a play, a TV movie, and an annual memorial ceremony at the site. It also set in motion 25 years of litigation that eventually cost the remaining 3,500 civilian residents their homes and property. What you're about to see and hear are the images and words of residents of this quintessential American small town, once vibrant, now swept away. This reading is a memorial and love letter to the town and people of Port Chicago, California.
Recent entries from Port Chicago Family Facebook group. Shirley Schmidt McKinnon.
This morning, I'm thinking about neighbors on the east side of Park Avenue. We lived at 133. From the bottom of the bumpy road going north were John, Daisy, and Eleanor Stebbins. Next was a small rental with a cottage behind it. Irene and Linda Perry lived in the front house at some time. Ming Dano's ranch was at the bottom of the street.
Peggy Morris.
I loved looking at people's yards, all the different flowers, and stealing peaches and apricots off trees. And Michael McKay's grandparents' house had kumquats that I used to pluck and eat when I passed by. Oh, and Marcia Ravisa and I ate pomegranates and picked walnuts from the Mahoney's tree.
Diana Bondi.
Looking back on my childhood days growing up in Port Chicago, they were my most carefree days of my life. No one had to lock their doors. You could walk to every corner of the town. You knew practically everyone you met. Oh yes, those were great times.
Jennifer Chomer.
Now, when Port Chicago comes to mind, I'm always doing the same thing. I take my bike to the end of Park Avenue where the bumpy road ends. I climb on and go, pedaling as fast as I can, gathering all the speed that I can muster, flying with the wind in my hair past all the bungalows and cottages, past my house, until I get to Olga Rosenthal's house. It is there where I quit pedaling and I glide. I glide around the bend and down the road to Main Street, trying to see how far down the street I can do. I go this same little journey over and over again, trying to go a little further each time. Afterwards, I go home to our sweet home on Park Avenue. My mother greets me with a smile. She says, "Mrs. Hewlett and Mrs. Elliott called to say they saw you and your pink bicycle go by. I knew you were okay." I feel so safe and secure. I feel like I'm home. I don't think I've ever felt like that again.
Port Chicago began its life as Bay Point, a company town founded by the C.A. Smith Lumber Company in 1907. After a great fire in 1913, it reopened in 1916 as the Coos Bay Lumber Company until the Great Depression forced its doors closed in 1932. Town matriarch Eunice Van Winkle.
The name Bay Point was given to the depot of the Southern Pacific Railroad when it first built its lines through this section in the late 1800s. It was not until 1907 that the C.A. Smith Lumber Company came to California and created the company town of Bay Point.
From the Contra Costa Gazette, January 14th, 1931.
Bay Point adopts port name Chicago. Chicago, California was born last night, and Bay Point passed into oblivion. Henceforth, if the Postmaster General will accede to the requests of the populace here, this community will bear the name of the great industrial city that fronts Lake Michigan.
From Images of America, Port Chicago, by Dean McLeod.
The dumping of Bay Point signs culminated in a death and birth pageant with fireworks, speeches, and a big dance. Mayors, industrialists, and representatives from around the Bay attended the bash. The mayor of Chicago, Illinois, wrote in part, "Our city is deeply mindful of the compliment you have conferred on us in making our city your godfather." Immediately afterward, pressure was put on the U.S. Post Office to prevent use of the name, ultimately resulting in the town becoming Port Chicago.
In 1917, Bay Point and its strategic location on the Sacramento River Delta caught the attention of the U.S. Navy, who contracted the Pacific Coast Shipping Company to build 10,000-ton freighters to replace those lost in the Great War. Following the end of the war, it shut down in 1920. Mindful of its strategic location at the mouth of the San Pablo Bay, the War Department established a naval ammo depot in 1942, forever changing the destinies of the town and its residents. Eunice Van Winkle.
Dock and rail lines were established. In a short time, explosives were being loaded on ships to be sent to the war zone. The population of the town doubled, and all the businesses and residences were crowded beyond capacity.
From Points West, Saturday Evening Post, Fall 1967. John Gregory Dunn.
A dog sat scratching itself in the middle of Main Street the afternoon I drove into Port Chicago, past the trailer camp on the outskirts of town and the pastel bungalows with peeling paint and flaking plaster. There was a Greyhound depot on Main Street and a barber shop that had gone out of business, and Dee's Bargain Shop, where the window display was a collection of unmatched plates and plastic drinking glasses and broken coffee pots and mended irons. "Hello, pal," said the faded lettering on the marquee of the crumbling Port Chicago Theater. "Yes, we are open every night." It was hard to believe that Port Chicago lay on a finger of San Francisco Bay, 20 miles from the Golden Gate. It has the feeling of the Dust Bowl, a forgotten hamlet on an unremembered side road from an age we would like to forget. It is a town to come from, a place to get out of, which is exactly what the United States Navy is trying to persuade the 3,200 inhabitants of Port Chicago to do.
Native son and U.S. Army Ranger David Perkins, in a letter to his cousin Janice Powell from February 29, 1944, while preparing for the D-Day invasion.
Cousin, received your letter. It was good to hear from you. By the way you expressed yourself in your letter, I thought I was hearing from a 20-year-old person. Then when I seen the letter, it was signed by a girl named Janice Powell. Well, it really knocked me for a loop. Nice going, and more power to you. I hear you and Tessie Blanchard are the Debs around Mount Diablo these days. Just watch out for the playboys. No doubt you've received that motherly advice before. Get everything you can out of high school, Janice. I'm not trying to give you the idea that I'm Father Time or Dr. Anthony, as I'm still 19 myself. But these are the best days of your life.
Oakland Tribune, July 18, 1944.
More than 300 men were killed and hundreds injured last night in a terrific explosion that destroyed 2 ammunition ships loading near Port Chicago, shaking homes, businesses, and buildings throughout the Bay Area. The force of the explosion, which shook residents out of their beds and broke windows 50 miles away, centered on 2 vessels loading shells at the dock between Avon and Port Chicago in Contra Costa County.
Martinez Gazette, July 18th, 1944.
More than 500 of the town's population of 1,500 were reported at least temporarily and possibly indefinitely homeless. Giant chunks of steel from the exploding vessels showered towards Port Chicago. The explosion, of undetermined origin, showered parts of the ship's superstructure at least a mile. One 300-pound piece of steel fell in the main street of Port Chicago, 1 mile from the Naval Depot.
Kenneth Tye, resident and author of At the Point of the Bay.
An Army Air Force plane flying at 9,000 feet saw a white flash with a large smoke ring about 3 miles wide. The pilot described pieces of white-hot metal, some as large as a house, flying straight up past the plane.
Art Schomer.
I was heading to Illinois from Port Chicago for specialized Army training. Our train had just gone over the Carquinez Bridge when I saw a flame shooting toward the sky. I told the guy next to me it was just a flare from Avon. No sooner did I say that when the car shook. There was another flare and I was knocked out of my seat. The windows blew out and the train stopped. The conductor yelled out that Port Chicago had blown up. Lillian had just dropped me off at the station, and I found out later she was 200 yards away when the explosion blew. She wired me at the next stop in Ogden, Utah, that she had escaped unharmed.
Dean McLeod.
Port Chicago was an all-American town. Born at the beginning of the 20th century, it survives today only in the memories and emotions of its former residents. It is a place some call blessed and some call cursed. Go to a reunion the last Saturday in July. You will feel the strength of the community, even 40 years after the federal government destroyed the town.
Some close calls. Daisy Somm.
I was in bed when the explosion happened. I got cut in 2 places, one right above my eye and one in my arm. The whole house was full of glass. We had a 2-story, 5-bedroom house on East Lind. Every window was blown out.
Sally McKinnon.
We lived up on the corner of Port Chicago Highway and Division Street. My mom and I were home, and my dad was at the bar. He was home on leave. He got knocked off the bar stool.
Grace Powell Merriman.
I was at a little construction house up on a hill counting the truckloads of dirt going out of the base when it hit. I saw it go up and it blew me out the length of 2 cars.
Horace Powell.
The whole front of the house was practically glass, and everybody at the time happened to be out in the kitchen when the ships blew up. The next day, we went back and took a look at the place. It was just like 1,000 arrows had come across the room and stuck. Shards of glass had stuck into that wall. I think we missed it by no more than 5 minutes. When I looked at that the next day, I could see some of those shards were like daggers. And that whole wall just full of them. I tell you, if I'd have been the fainting kind, I think I'd have fainted right then and there.
Rena DeMarco.
I was coming home from a carnival held on Main Street. My mother and I were walking when the ship exploded. I have visions of it as a fireball in the air, and we were thrown on the street. 2 shore patrol came and picked us up, took us into this saloon, Monterey's, I believe it was, and they had us laying in glass. They kept shouting, "I think it's the Japanese that have bombed."
Jim Delanisi.
My dad had the pool hall in Port Chicago. He'd just closed up, came home, shut the door, turned around, and the door hit him in the back and knocked him down. Blew all the windows in. My mom had about 200 pieces of glass in her. I was in bed right next to the window. I didn't have a scratch on me.
Jean Carroll.
I was running the projector in the theater 10 minutes before. I was leaving town when it happened. I had just moved out of Port Chicago and moved to Clyde, and you know, that sharp turn into Clyde going out of Port Chicago? I had just made that turn when the ship blew up. It just lifted me up and shoved me right over. When my car hit the pavement, the whole car just clanked, hit the rims, shrapnel falling all around me. And I could see puffs of dirt, and I just shot right along. My boy, who was 3 years old, just slept through the whole damn works. Never woke him up.
Charlie Carroll.
My daughter's bedroom, on the opposite side of the room, the ceiling all came down in pieces. Where she was, it all came down in one big piece, but the crib kept it out. There were pieces sticking in the wall. There were so many things, like where my head would be in the pillow, there was a shard of glass sticking right in.
Ralph Mahoney.
We lived at the Powells, a little house in the back on West Lynn Street. I was listening to the Richfield Reporter from 10 to 10:15. Kate went to bed before that, and she says, "Come on to bed." No, I'm listening to the reporter. As soon as the news is over, I'll get into bed.
Katie Mahoney.
We just got into bed when this thing went off, and all the windows came in, and I said, "We're being bombed." We lay there real quiet after that, and Charlie came over right after that, Charlie Bonkio, and he says, "Gee, you two all right?" And I says, "Yeah, but I gotta find Charlie, shine your light so I can find my pants." I will never forget that. Isn't that awful?
Horace Powell.
There was 1,000 cases just like that. I mean, there was the case where the piece of shrapnel came down right through the baby's crib, right through the floor into the ground, missed the baby. It was absolutely a miracle how that town escaped injury.
Edith Powell.
Anyway, then Horace took off, and he took people over to Concord, to the hospital, and there we were. Everybody was out in the yard. Fortunately, the kids had dug a big hole. You know how kids do. And we all crawled in there. But you know the funny thing? I had stationary tubs on my little back porch. And I had canned fruit that day. And not one jar broke. Not one jar fell off of there.
Olga Rosenthal.
The next morning, all the glasses and goblets, everything in the pantry had just splintered all over. Except when I went in the back porch and I looked, there was all the Christmas balls, decorations. You know how easy they break. Not a one of them was broken, but all the glass and everything in the pantry was. And one piece from the ship went right down and smashed the arm of the Chesterfield and dented the floor.
Mary Bidenost.
The lights went out with the first blast. Then came the big one. The blast had blown a chest of drawers in front of the door. Well, when Dad found out we was safe, he went to the firehouse. He was a volunteer fireman to make sure there were no fires and to help the wounded.
Some funny things. Horace Powell.
Hey, here's another funny thing. There were some funny episodes. You come out in the kitchen, and over here was a closed-in water heater. Well, it had one of those damn doors on it that you kind of had to lift it up and pull it out from the bottom to get it out. And I'll tell you, I've been trying to get that damn thing out for a coon's age, and I'd have to practically crowbar it out. And as we was coming out through here, and as I went by that thing, that door came out and hit me on the head. Now that's the truth. I'm not making it up.
Olga Rosenthal.
And another thing, when we came early the next morning, David had his dog Skipper, and we couldn't find him. And when we come back that next morning, there was Skipper in David's bed and glass all around. And you know, he stuck to me like a burr after that. He wouldn't move. I'd have to carry him to do everything.
Mary Delanisi.
I had just gotten home and was standing in the living room with my sister-in-law who had taken care of my little boy. When the first blast hit, I crawled on my hands and knees to get my son from his crib. The whole window had blown in, so I ducked down and wrapped him in a blanket. Just after the second jolt, my husband came in and said, "Oh my God, you're bleeding all over." I was one of the lucky ones, though. 2 of our neighbors each lost an eye in the explosion.
3 sisters. Olga Rosenthal, Ruth Swan, and Edith Powell.
It was on a Monday,
On your son's birthday.
on my son's birthday, and Dave was overseas, and Anyway, I always went to the library on Mondays, so I told his father, I'm going down there. And this is the first time Port Chicago had a carnival, right across in an empty lot there. And he says, I think I'll walk with you. And so we stopped at the library, and then we went on to Edith's house, and there everybody was.
There was a Penny Anna game.
Yes.
And the kids were all at the carnival.
Janice was at the movie.
Do you know the picture that was playing?
Bloody China, I think it was?
China. And there was an explosion in the picture just as it happened. We were all jammed in the kitchen.
Yeah, and I thought the hot water tank blew up because it was right there in the kitchen there, you know, and all at once the lights went out and everything, and we said, my God, what's happened?
The movie theater. Horace Powell.
Janice had gone to the show that night, and there were some big explosions or something in the picture when the ships blew up, and they didn't realize it at first. And the next thing they knew, I guess, it was chaos.
Janice Powell McKinnon.
There was a circus in town, and I went to a show with Barbara Carroll and Don Gustafson, and we had a bag of apricots. And we were eating them and throwing the pits on the floor. Well, at least I was. And we were watching China with Alan Ladd, and there was a grenade scene where, when the grenade went off, everything went off. And it took a second for it. It was so real, you couldn't tell, you know, what was happening. And I got thrown to the floor because I can remember trying to get up and slipping on the apricot pits. I could not get up. And I did remember looking up out the side of the theater that was open, and I could just see all the fireworks, like a tremendous 4th of July, you know, just everything going up. And of course, everybody immediately thought Japanese, you know, so I scrambled out and I managed to get out and get inside. And I saw people just running down the street, and I'm yelling, get down, you know?
It was raining shrapnel all over town. There was a piece come down on the roof of my place, cracked the roof rafters, and bounced off into the yard. All over town, you were picking up pieces as small as your fingernail to over 100 pounds.
So I ran out and I threw myself in the empty field, but I could hear all this whistling, you know, like chunks of shrapnel and everything falling. And so, well, then I got up and started running for home, and Mr. Somm, who was our civil defense warden, spotted me and was trying to catch up, but he never did catch up to me, and I ran all the way home.
Clara Woods McKinnon.
I had gone to the movie with my sister Grace and my best friend Fran Denton. When the blast went off, the exit doors to the theater blew in, and we could see the huge flash of light from the waterfront. Fran and I found our way outside, and when we couldn't find Grace, the owner of the theater loaned us a flashlight to go back in and try to find her. We groped around inside but still couldn't find her. So we decided to go to my house to let my mother know that my sister was missing. Upon arriving home, much to our surprise, there was Grace. It seems that the man who owned the local pool hall spotted her, pulled over, and grabbed her, put her in the car, and took her home.
So anyway, Janice had listened to our advice that if there's any bombing that goes on and you're outside, lay down in a field. So what she done, she got out of the theater, and right across the road was this field right there. And she'd gone out there and lay down, and when I went down to get her, I couldn't find her anywhere.
Two brothers, Charlie and Jean Carroll.
I was in bed. I don't know if I was asleep or not. I don't know if it blew me out of bed or I got out of bed. I was walking around the house barefoot. I knew something blew up. I didn't know it was a ship.
You were naked, weren't you? You hauled Diddy and the kids, Bobby and Nancy, out behind a cement barrier.
An old building foundation behind our house. I think Bobby was in the theater.
Yes, she was with Janice. Yeah, they were on the side that didn't cave in. But yeah, Bobby and Janice were in there.
It never caved in until the next day. The roof caved in then, but the sides caved in the next day. Nobody was killed. Lauren Clark's wife had her eye put out.
Meeting the captain of the Ryan, Horace Powell.
In the meantime, I was downtown looking around, and it looked just like a slaughterhouse. These guys, these sailors, were running around, and they needed help. So I took a carload of them over to Concord. As it happened, one of the walking wounded I picked up was the captain of the Ryan, one of the ships that blew up. Well, anyway, as I come back to town, they had the town blockaded already. I told them I just brought a bunch of guys over, and I was taking them back, and that I lived in town. It didn't hurt any that this guy spoke up and mentioned he was the captain. That's how I found out he was the captain of the Ryan.
Pittsburgh Post-Dispatch, July 26, 1944.
Award for blast heroine. Mrs. Mary S. Welburn was on duty when the explosion converted the Port Chicago business and residential districts into shambles. 6 of her 7 circuits were knocked out by concussion at 10:17 p.m. Tuesday. She reported the explosion to the outside world on her one remaining switchboard and stayed at her switchboard until 1 p.m. Wednesday, despite injuries suffered from flying glass and an exploding shell.
The girls who ran the switchboard during the days after the explosions, when everything was such a mess, ought to be getting a medal, not me. I didn't know there were so many reporters in the world until that night.
3 sisters. Ruth Swan's story.
I had been catering and had come home to Oakland on Linden Street. We went out and had watermelon, my daughter who was living in Oakland, and all at once, kabam! Our table moved, watermelon seeds everywhere, and I was out there wiping, and another one came, and my daughter had already gone to her apartment. Pretty soon she comes in, "Mom, Port Chicago's blown up." I said, "Oh, for God's sakes." I said, "How bad?" And I said, No, that explosion must have been at where's that powder plant, you know?
Hercules.
In Hercules.
As I said, "Oh, that's Hercules. That's not Port Chicago." So I hurried and I put my white catering uniform on. And they said, "Everyone, come down to the auditorium in Oakland." So I rushed down there and I begged the man who had charge of it. I said, "I've got 49 relatives up there." I said, "I've got to get up there." Finally, a nurse overheard me, and she said, "Come with me, we'll take you in the car." And when we got there, they looked in and said, "All nurses?" I never said a word, I didn't lie. And they let us go through. So we rode around all night long, and the first ones that were there to give donuts were the Salvation Army at 2 o'clock in the morning. Red Cross didn't come till the next day.
Salvation Army versus the Red Cross.
I
Leo
was-
DeMarco.
I was, 13. We were waiting for the Salvation Army to come by and give us candy bars. The Red Cross, forget it. You had to sign your life away. Go down to the school, get in a line 20 miles long. But the Salvation Army wasn't that way. They'd come around in those little carts and they'd see you, stop, open up the side doors, and they'd give candy bars, cocoa, whatever. I help the Salvation Army every chance I get.
Clara Woods.
The next morning, around the corner came a Salvation Army canteen on wheels, with not only coffee on board, but hot chocolate, juices, sweet rolls, and donuts. This was such a treat for us. We were willing to live this way for a very long time.
Clarence Olson.
Yeah, the Salvation Army, they was the ones that give. They was the ones that really done something around there. They was really the ones who brought coffee and donuts and really took care of everybody down there.
The Fighting Area. Horace Powell.
Everyone who was killed down in what I call the fighting area, if you went down the main street, you turned left to go to Martinez. Well, what we called everything down below there was the naval base. Everybody that was killed was down below that section.
Regarding Elmer Freud. Jean Carroll.
Elmer was at my house that night before. He and I was drinking beer the night before he got killed. He came over to Clyde there, visited me and my brother Frank. He was drinking beer with me the night before, and the night before that we was down at Sarah's drinking beer. Elmer and I were real good buddies.
Charlie Carroll.
Who?
Elmer Freud.
Oh, he got killed because another fella asked him to take his shift.
That's right.
He was supposed to have been off.
Yeah, that's right. He's been in the Navy. He made a 4-year hitch before that.
That's right.
But when the war started, he decided to go back in and they give him his position right there in his old hometown.
He wasn't supposed to be working that night.
If he'd been out drinking beer with me, he wouldn't have gotten killed. He blew up with the ship. Elmer was a nice guy. He was a real fine person.
September 8th, 1944. U.S. Public Law 423 authorizes the Navy to settle claims of the Port Chicago disaster. Damages and reparations. Clarence Olson.
Oh yeah, just like the rest of them, it had blowed the hell out of my house. I had all new furniture, wrecked the furniture, all this here glass flying around, and then the Navy come around and give you the great big old benefit, you know, and out of the whole works I got $31.95.
Ruth Swan.
Everyone was trying to move out at that time. And if you'd have had money, you could have bought houses for a little. I bought one for $2,500 as is.
Edith Powell.
Unfortunately, we bought one 3 weeks before the explosion. We were stuck 3 weeks before the explosion. We'd have got out of town. Our whole lives would have changed.
Charlie Carroll.
Everything blew up in my house. I got $62. That's all I got out of it. $62. It ruined a set of dishes and scarred my ice box when a window blew on it. Everything. Tore up my Chesterfield. The door blew off and went through my Chesterfield. And I got $62.
Martinez Gazette, July 26th, 1944.
Otto Lichty, a druggist, said he suffered a $15,000 loss and had no idea as to when he would be back in business. Representative George Miller, Democrat, California, predicted it might take years before all claims were settled.
Clarence Olson.
Oh yeah, they gave the people an awful Yansen. The only ones who made any money were the contractors. As far as the government, seemed like they took care of the renters better than the damages of the people owning the houses.
Remembering the Corner Club. Barbara Farley.
I grew up with the Corner Club, since my parents owned it, until the town was closed down. I would stop by, and my father would give me and whoever was with me a soft drink.
Ewell Terry.
There was a series of fights broke out between some Port Chicago men and sailors from the Navy base. It started when our little group of local sheetrockers got off work and went to the Corner Club for drinks. Also in the bar was a group of sailors, also drinking. Eventually, somebody said something that somebody else didn't like, and a fight broke out between me and a sailor, with everyone else gathered around cheering for their guy. As we were thrashing around on the floor, in through the door come 2 shore patrolmen.
John Woods.
The SPs ran up to the men swinging their batons, but they weren't trying to hit the sailor, they were clubbing Ewell exclusively. To make matters worse, the other sailors who'd been watching started kicking Ewell. So I come running across the room and plowed into the group with a flying tackle. I couldn't believe it. Every sailor in that room went down like bowling pins.
Red Arnold.
So I waded in to help. But by now it's brawl, locals against sailors, and by now the fight spilled out of the bar and into the street. Now, remember that we were sheetrockers. Well, our trucks were parked out in front of the bar, and in the back were our tools. A couple of us reached into our buckets and grabbed our axes, and the fight was over. It became a rout, with the sailors all fleeing down Main Street.
1952. For 8 years after the explosion, the town enjoys a period of growth and economic prosperity until the Navy makes the first of 9 attempts to buy the town. Local congressional representative John Baldwin.
The only way the Navy would get Port Chicago is over my dead body.
1966. Congressman John Baldwin, who for 14 years had blocked the Navy takeover bids of Port Chicago, dies. October 1967. Congress passes Public Law 9110 authorizing acquisition of all lands within a 2-mile radius of the ordnance loading piers of Port Chicago, including residences, roadways, train lines, chemical plants, and other businesses. Not mentioned is that immediately outside and adjacent to the safety zone lies the town of Concord, population 100,000. Dean McLeod.
By the time of the Vietnam War, a crisis of security faced the Navy. Having shipped nuclear weapons through the base at least since 1945 and all through the Cold War, it became imperative for the Navy not to have a town of 3,500 people right in the middle of their operations. Using a safety study based on the 1944 explosion as a cover story, the Navy waged a public relations and covert economic war against the town people.
A U.S. Navy public affairs officer states, "For $19 million, we can remove 3,200 people from a lethal area. It's as simple as that." John Gregory Dunn.
A poll taken in the town has revealed that 76% of the people there do not want to leave Port Chicago. I wondered what I would do. I thought if I lived there, I would vote to take the government's money and run. But that is the point. I do not live there. The point came home to me as I sat in Fink's Silver Pitcher on Main Street. A stevedore who lived in one of the outlying towns said to an elderly Port Chicagoan, "The Navy's giving you a good deal. What do you want to live in this dump for?" The native son looked out the window at Main Street for a long time before he gave his answer. "It's home, I guess," he said finally.
Jennifer Chomer.
My father and Elcio DeMarco went to Sacramento to try to line up support for the town. I remember my dad in heated debates and discussions with his friends about Governor Ronald Reagan. He said that Reagan said, "It's just a little town. In the big picture, no one will remember it." My dad never got over the fact that we'd elected an actor for a governor.
Art Chomer.
We were no longer at war. Why should we have to move when the threat of war was gone? I took the town's plea to Sacramento to Governor Reagan. After hearing what we had to say, he quipped, "Remind me not to go to Contra Costa County." To us, it was life and death. To him, it was a joke.
March 1968. Exodus from Port Chicago begins. Patrick Leslie.
I remember in late 1968 when a lot of non-Port Chicago people would come to town and tear up the houses that were empty. Strange cars driving around during the day, seeing what they could steal. Some town folks said that when they came home from shopping, they had people in their yards stealing their plants and trees. Insult to injury. Salt in the wound.
Elcio DeMarco.
You couldn't believe the things that went on. People from the outlying communities came in and dug up shrubs and flowers. I saw prominent business people from Concord bring kids over and scavenge the houses to see if they could find anything they could use.
Marie Sanders.
People would try to steal things while we were there. Mom ran several of them off. Many people didn't realize that some town folk, mine included, held on till the bitter end. I can remember practicing casting a fishing rod in the middle of the street while bulldozers were tearing down houses on our block.
By 1968, the Naval Weapons Station is shipping 3 times the explosives that were shipped during 1944. 70% of the explosives for Vietnam go through Port Chicago docks. Michael Mulcahy.
I was lucky enough to spend most of my childhood and teenage years in Port Chicago. I was 17 when we moved away in the summer of '68, so I didn't miss out on much that was involved with growing up there. I always wonder what my adult life would have been like if the town was still there. Would I have settled there? I like to think so. I've lived in a lot of different places in California, but a lot of the reason is that I can't move back to Port Chicago.
1968, Bay Point Elementary closes. Jennifer Chomer.
By December 1968, Port Chicago was pretty much a ghost town. A lot of families were moving out on Christmas Eve. My mother was sick in the hospital with cancer and pneumonia. I was worried about the junior prom, my dress, and if I was going to go get to park and make out afterwards. You know, the important things. I tried to do the Christmas baking, shopping, and to attend to the list of to-dos that my mother was directing from her sick bed. We didn't even have a Christmas tree. My dad said, "Don't worry, Jenny, we'll take care of it." He actually jumped a barbed wire fence and took one from the lot. It was the act of a desperate man. We were a tragedy in motion, just going through the motions of holiday cheer in a cheerless town.
Julie Leaf.
My family was one of the last to leave. We held out as long as we could. When we finally left, we were loaded up in our car, and my dad, as a last act of defiance, threw a brick through the front window of our house. I was 12 at the time. I remember things as if it were yesterday.
June 10th, 1969. Port Chicago Post Office closes. Contra Costa Times, 1969. Armed Colquico defends his Port Chicago home.
Port Chicago resident Daniel Colquico, armed with a rifle Friday, defended his home from U.S. Marshals. Colquico, who is a native of Port Chicago and resides at 324 Division Street with his wife and their 5 children, defended his actions simply.
They've trespassed on my property. I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. I told them to get the hell off my property and they left. This is the biggest, most rotten military land grab since the Indians. As a citizen, I'm going to keep them off my property until they can legally prove that it's theirs. This is definitely a land grab under the false pretenses that it's for our safety. They say it is for us. I don't believe it.
The former San Francisco 49er and Port Chicago's most stalwart defender declared again he will not abandon his home despite attempts by the federal government to throw him out. Apparently, he will defend it, if necessary, with his Winchester. Nearly 3,500 residents have been displaced by the Navy's takeover of the town.
Jennifer Chomer.
My father always said, "We're going to fight till the end, Jenny." Now, all these years later, I feel this pull from beyond, this deep calling. Somehow, I need to finish his courageous fight by not letting the memory of our town die. He fought so hard and so long. Sometimes I feel like my mother Lily's breast cancer return after remission was due to the fact that Port Chicago was lost. I wonder to this day about the connection of the town's death to my mother's final battle.
From a letter to Mr. and Mrs. Terrence Beidelman from the U.S. Attorney, dated November 7th, 1969.
Enclosed is a copy of our letter to your attorneys, Cox and Cummins, and to Transamerica Title Insurance Company, where we have deposited the sum of $14,000 for your benefit.
November 15th, 1969. Port Chicago's last civilian residents are Mr. and Mrs. Terry Beidelman. Beidelman, a World War II veteran of the Navy, was the last man to leave his residence, just in front of the bulldozer that leveled his home. The barricaded Beidelman said of his eviction from his home,
I think the country stinks.
February 11th, 1995. Port Chicago Highway closes to public travel between Nichols Road and Clyde. Patrick Leslie.
I miss the closeness of a small town where you know everyone. As the years go by, the memories do not fade but grow more in my heart. And I know how lucky we all were. Not a day goes by that I don't think of family or Port Chicago.
Ken Rand.
Sometimes I drive to the empty place where Port Chicago used to be. I look at the field and remember things. I remember playing as a kid and losing this hand puppet. I could walk back to the hedge near the school where I lost it, and I think I can find it.
Julie Leaf.
I still have dreams to this day of driving down Main Street. Some people think that kids don't remember things, but in my mind's eye, I can see me and my cousins at our grandparents' large house, just enjoying being kids. The life we had in Port Chicago is what you see on TV with Mayberry. Everybody in town knew everybody else. It was perfect and will always be a part of who I am. The town wasn't just a place, it was also a state of mind.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're happy to have you get a drink now, and if you want to stick around and ask a few questions, we actually have some Portucogans in the house. I'd actually like to single out, Shirley, would you stand up? This is my Aunt Shirley. She was actually the first character to speak. Shirley came all the way down from the East Bay to see this. She actually lived through the explosion. Your mother was injured quite badly, too. Yeah. And then I've also Michael McKay. Michael just discovered that I plagiarized one of his posts into a three-part exchange, but it was well written, Michael. Very well done. Are there any questions about this project or Port Chicago or anything you might want to know? Yes?
Two questions. What's there today? If you visited that site, what would you see?
Well, you cannot visit the site. It's still closed off by, now the Army runs the site. But if you were to go there, you would see some outbuildings, and if you knew where you were going, the grid, the ironic peace sign grid, is actually still there. My sister Jill, who's also a Port Chicago native, believe it or not.
The second question is, there was somebody there named Rosenthal. I just wonder if they were related in any way to Pulitzer Prize winning photographer Joe Rosenthal, who's from the Bay Area.
I don't believe so, but I'm speaking out of turn. That was our great aunt, Alma Rosenthal, and her husband Vince was the one we knew. So that's still a possibility, but unaware. Something worthy of checking out.
Vince, in fact, was probably one of the casualties that Jenny Chilmer was referring to about the mortality rate of people who moved out. Vince had a massive stroke as they were moving out of town. And he lived a few more years, but his life was ill and changed. Yes?
Hi, was that ever produced as a radio show?
That's a good question. Well, we are actually the only ones who ever put anything like this together, and tonight was actually recorded on a multi-track mobile van outside, and with the film footage we have tonight, we're hoping to put together a record of this event so that we can, you want to talk about those, getting into the schools and that kind of thing?
Yes,
Just use the mic right now so Terry can get into the recording truck.
yes, one of our next hopeful projects is to do outreach, especially into the districts that have descendants. Mount Diablo School District in Concord, and possibly Walnut Creek School District, and as well as Pittsburgh and Antioch, so that there is some kind of a record in our California history of this amazing incident that is largely unknown, unfortunately. The biggest inland disaster of World War II, most people don't know it happened. So that would be our next step, to try to get it into our curriculum, especially the local area.
The mutiny and the trial are fairly well known in comparison. There's a kind of a myth going around that Port Chicago is actually a Navy base. Port Chicago was a town. It had nothing to do with the explosion, but the explosion had everything to do with Port Chicago from that point on. So what we're trying to do is make people remember that yes, there was a town there, and what happened with the black sailors was tragic. There was an injustice. The last of them were exonerated, I believe, by President Clinton. I think they're all gone now, but that story's been told many times, many ways, and so what we're trying to do is create a companion piece to that history that's fairly well known. which I believe deserves a part alongside the mutiny trial, which shouldn't be forgotten either. Jill.
Jeff, what was the process in interviewing the people from the town and getting these stories? Were they extrapolated or?
Well, in 1983, I went to a reunion picnic and I had a handheld cassette recorder. And I was always fascinated with the town as a kid. I was 10 years old when the town closed. But I actually, the first interviews were taken in West Pittsburgh, which is now called Bay Point. But West Pittsburgh hosted the Port Chicago reunion the last Saturday in July for about 50 years. And I got the basic recordings. Many of those people passed. I sat on the tape for 20 years or so. And then I started to dig it up again. And Francesca, stand up. Francesca Davis was part of my theater class 10 years ago, where I actually decided, okay, we need a project. Let's take all these transcripts I have and newspaper articles, and let's make a play. So Francesca was part of the first group that formulated this. It's changed quite a bit, but you have.
I was just going to say, I was one of the sisters when we performed it.
Right, I think I have a picture of that, yeah.
I want to just mention that Jeff has taken on the role of historian and archivist here, going back 40 plus years. This story couldn't be told the way that it's being told if he hadn't done that. And I'm his older brother Matthew, and I have vivid memories of Port Chicago, and this it brings back so many emotions for me. I'm sure for Shirley, for Michael Mulcahy, and others, and he just deserves so many kudos I can't even tell you.
Sam.
Yeah, Jeff, it was kind of understated the McKinnon family's Port Chicago roots in this. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, Shirley is part of that history. I like to joke that the McKinnons, who are from Concord, by the way, which is right next door, are probably the most well-connected clan in Port Chicago because my dad and two of his brothers married 3 Port Chicago gals.
Gorgeous Port Chicago.
And the picture up there I put in, it went by far too briefly, but and my dad has a very large family in Concord, interestingly, we always felt a stronger connection to the Port Chicago side of the family. There was just something about the Port Chicago vibe that just got under our skin, and my grandparents lived there until the end, and then they moved up to Butte County.
But our great-grandparents were some of the early Port Chicago residents coming from a Swedish migration for my grandmother Edith's side, and then on my grandfather's side from French Canada. And that migration and that immigrant story is one of the most powerful things about this little town. It's an American town. This is repeated all over our country. And those roots, deeply rooted in our immigrant migrations through our great, great country, is modeled in this little town.
My actors were trying to figure out, because I listening to the tapes, trying to figure out the accent, and Port Chicago has actually been cited in a phonetic journal, or the North Contra Costa County, as having a unique accent, and it was so recently formed, and yet it had such a different demographic than most of the towns in Contra Costa County, because for about 5 years, there was more Swedish spoken in Port Chicago than there was English. And then when the lumber mill burned down and they opened a chemical plant and a box factory, they hired mostly Italian, Greek, and Portuguese immigrants. So you have this, if you listen to the tapes, you just have this wild, weird accent. And they played fast and easy with the conjugation of verbs. getting my actors to read what's actually on the page was kind of, because we want to do autocorrect as we speak it, but that's one of the things that made Port Chicago so unique, I think, was its recent immigration makeup. Yes?
When I was listening to the play and after and everything you said, I thought, well, here we are. We're all here in this room, our little town. And it made me feel really great and
Well, if you can imagine the town roughly the size of Solvang. And they were handed checks between $10,000 and $15,000 and said, "Thank you, see you later." You can take your house with you, by the way, and some of them did. But for most people, it was a major loss, not just financially, but holistically.
Did the residents kind of scatter, or did they say, okay, why don't we all go to Antioch or wherever?
It was to the four winds. A diaspora that is really kind of tragic.
No center of gravity.
No, there was a reunion, and valiantly people kept trying to bring people together. And now, sadly, that generation that lived through the explosion is passing. And those of us, like Jeff and me, and that, I was 17. And Jenny Chalmer, and Michael, and Jenny's mother was dying of cancer as she packed boxes to go. And she said she's never felt home since. Someone asked, what is there now? And I don't know if, Michael, you were able to go when they let the Port Chicago residents go back in 2 years ago to see what's there. We had to get clearance through the Army, which now owns the base. We had to be escorted in by the Army to see nothing left. Completely leveled, weeds, the wind, some broken pavement, one Main Street sign. And I tried to find where my grandparents' house might have been. I could see a row of eucalyptus trees that might have marked the back of their property. But people wandered, trying to find where their home was. And nothing. So imagine that. And most of those people were children at the time.
Yeah, we were kids, and we're now oldsters. And we're the last generation that can see the town in our mind's eye, that actually set foot there. So we talk a lot about what's going to happen to the memory of Port Chicago when we pass, and it's going to be a lot of hearsay, second-hand stuff. Even my Port Chicago page, I can tell the demographic has changed in 10 years. So many of the older generation has passed. And so it's always been my commitment to sort of establish the history of places so that people remember, so that there's something to look back at and see where we came from. And hopefully to see that the same mistakes and injustices don't happen again. But that's pretty idealistic, I know. But I'm just happy to have this little slice preserved. And fortunately, thanks to Ron's generosity for producing us, and just this amazing space and community, and the fact that we're recording this event tonight makes us feel like we accomplished something. And we're so happy that you all got to share and be part of this event tonight. It's meant so much to us. Anything else? Ask me anything. Ask me anything.
Jeff, I just wanted to say one thing from the back is it's really inspiring how you woven art with environmental tragedy and history that's in our state. And it happens to be an event that was the biggest and the most hidden. So it's pretty shocking to witness. But it's also opening up the door the way you did this in a grassroots way
Thank you. Thanks, Barry. When Francesca's class was in my, I taught at the high school. I taught theater for 23 years here locally. I kind of lost my train of thought there. And I'm only 65. I know what I want to say. This form, we introduced it with Francesca's class because they were really an advanced and committed group. It was a great group of kids that year. It's called Docudrama, and it's actually taken from the 1930s. It was a WPA form of theater that they borrowed from the Russians at the time, because the Soviet Union had a very progressive approach to the arts and theater in those days. And so we borrowed some of that, but it was able to incorporate current events into a theatrical form in a way that informs first, entertains second. And so the commitment always is to have a discussion, and for you guys to take something away that you can think about and talk about, and hopefully, still give you an enjoyable evening. But that was something that if you've seen any of my productions, if you've seen more than 4 of my productions, what we specialized in, and my partner Dave Johnson's sitting here, and Dave was my lighting designer, but Dave was with me every step of the way on this stuff, never questioned my weird ideas. But this one is just as theatrical as a naturalistic play in terms of the way it can suck you in and change your outlook on something. And that's really, I think theater is one of the best bully pulpits in the world. And we still have theater. Any other questions? Yes.
I just want to thank you so much for putting this together, Jeff, because I think all of us can think of whether it's our own hometowns or different things, and how many different ways. Well, let me put it back. I look back at how I have many friends in western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, and how things just disappeared for them. Obviously, what happened in Los Angeles, in Altadena and Palisades. But in another way, I grew up in Menlo Park. I go back there now, and it is not the same city that I went to, and it's absolutely totally changed. And I don't mean that it's just. I mean it's an entirely. It was destroyed, and it's not the little town that I grew up in. Everything was the opposite. It was totally rebuilt, and all the houses that were one story, little things that we walked and that, I mean, so and maybe it causes me to think of how things have been destroyed in my own life, people that I know. I'm so glad you did this, because it really got me thinking in ways that I hadn't thought before, and it really just opened up some things that really sort of made a lot of sense to me. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks very much. And Palisades and LA and that disasters happen. They're not going to stop happening. But I think the point we'd like people to think about is, how do we deal with the disaster afterwards? How do we show our humanity to people who lose everything? And it's always, and I'm only speaking for myself, it's always somebody else. But I think recent events have shown it can happen to anybody. And we'd sure like to know that our community will step up afterwards, because that's who we are. And so that's what this story's about.
That's one of the things that happened with this band replacement program we have going on right now. The band director said, not only is it important to get the instruments replaced, but these kids, they know that somebody cares.
Amen.
So another way looking forward, the little town of Port Chicago and all the work that's been done to preserve its history has partnered with the history of the black sailors and the mutiny, and they were exonerated this summer by the U.S. Department of the Navy. Finally, after years and years and years of fighting for that vindication of being able to stand up for basic civil rights and equal rights. So moving forward, we want to combine forces for peace and justice and civil rights, and hopefully part of that curriculum would trickle down into our schools. We all know the value of home and hearth. We all know how we need to protect our families and our home and hearth. We also need to look to the unhoused and see what we can do to bring that basic human right to have home and hearth and the values that we so endear, not just in our own homes and communities, but throughout this country. So